Digging deeper.
Yes,
We're
it
back.
is. And we're digging.
We're going to dig deeper. Hey, it's Robert and Pete. We're diving into, we were in week number 4-ish or somewhere there of our Minor Prophet series. And you led us through a really cool discussion about the book of, some say Habakuk, others say Habakuk.
Some say Habakuk.
Habakuk.
Some sound like a hiccup. It's just Habakuk.
Yeah. Nobody actually knows how to pronounce it, which is always a fun thing about Old Testament stuff. I get it a lot. I'm sure you do as a pastor. Like people like reading their Bible, like, hey, you're a pastor. How do I pronounce this? And you're like, nobody knows.
My favorite part is when people vehemently argue that it's supposed to be
like, no, that is
pronounced
not
a certain way. Like, it's not Isaiah, it's Isaiah. And you're like, okay.
So
that one's a little bit...
Isaiah is a difficult one. So if you even look at the minor prophets, we've got Obadiah, Jeremiah, Hezekiah, Zechariah, Isaiah. Like really like Isaiah.
Yeah, I hear it too.
Isaiah has an A in front of the IA. So it's very difficult. Anyway, what a strange way to start this podcast.
But that's what Digging Deeper is for.
Exactly. But yeah, to be fair, the Old Testament was written in a language that, thousands of years ago. So even though people still speak Hebrew today, dialects have changed so much. It's really hard to know how you would have pronounced some of those things. Greek is a little bit different because, we have a slightly better understanding of how Koine Greek was pronounced. So the New Testament. But yeah, Old Testament stuff, a lot of times we're just guessing.
Yeah. And I think that I pronounced Habakuk different times throughout the same message over and over again, which is kind of fun.
So then Habakuk, and so Habakuk comes back. And,
yes.
Wait, what?
Maybe even in the same sentence, I pronounced it differently. It was great.
So before we get into that, you also told us you turned 40 last week.
Yeah,
I did. Big 4-0. And it's pretty cliche that people will joke about, like how they feel about 40s. But with you, like, you had, I don't know if we had talked about this. I got to apologize. Like, I can't remember if this was in your message or you and I talked about it, but how you mentioned, I think it was to me, that you had a friend who turned 40 a while ago and you did like a full on, you got him a walker and all this kind of stuff.
My dad.
That was your dad. Okay.
My dad. So we actually threw an entire over the hill party for him. And it was like this big bash. And it's like one of those core memories for me.
And now that you're 40, you're like, oh, that was mean.
well, and also it kind of created a crisis in me because we did that whole thing, made all the jokes when he was 40, like, oh, you're over the hill, you're so old now. And then he got cancer just a few years afterwards, and then he passed away at 49. Oh, man. And so 40 is actually a little bit of a crisis on a personal level for me because if I look at that direct example, it starts to feel like I'm at the end of my life. What am I? Yeah. Oh my goodness. Do I have any time left?
Which is kind of the hallmark of what we often call a midlife crisis, and coming to that place of like.
So I better go buy a Corvette now while I still can.
So when I was, I would have been probably 22, 23. The guy that I worked for at the time, he was the youth pastor of youth ministry. He turned 40, and I remember like similarly, like this very vivid memory. And his wife planned it. I was just part of it. She literally got a guy who also worked at our church to pretend to be like an Irish priest doing a funeral.
Oh my goodness.
And she invited everybody to his party and told all of us that none of us could acknowledge him. We all had to go up pretending we're at a funeral.
So you just had to pretend like he was dead.
So we didn't even talk to him. And
terrible.
He was so angry. And then she had a veil on and she was crying. And I remember just thinking it was super funny and being like, this is hilarious. But then
it's cruel.
I was like, oh my gosh.
That's
I would hate it if you did that to me.
Diabolical, man. Yeah. That's messed up. Honey, my wife, thank you so much for not doing that.
However, I will say this, and I'm sure that everyone says this when they reach this age, but I actually think this is true. I do think with the advent of healthcare, medicine, technology, 40 is not what it used to be.
No.
Sometimes you see those memes of like people who were 30 in the 80s versus 30 today, and even 40, like, I think it's a different thing, but still it can hit you weird.
Yeah.
Did it hit you weird
a little bit, definitely, a minor crisis for a minor prophet book, but no, a little bit of a minor bit, but it just feels, it feels like legitimate adulthood. Yeah. Before this, I felt like I was playing an adult. Now at 40, it feels like I'm a legitimate adult. I'm like, oh man, I probably Should
Yeah.
check my 401k again. You know, stuff like that.
No, yeah, it's weird. It's a weird thing. Yeah. I mean, you don't really think about, you reach that point where you start thinking about life and the future and the world differently.
Yeah.
And when you're younger, you're like, oh, midlife, it's funny to you. And then you hit it and you're like, oh, I see now why they felt that way.
Yep.
So, and then you sort of started there, but where you were going was really the bigger idea of just wrestling with God in general, of wrestling with things not necessarily being the way that you want them to be, wrestling with things not working out or God not doing what you may have wanted him to do or didn't want him, expectations, all these kind of things, which brings us to Habakkuk. Maybe, I know generally speaking, we always encourage people who listen to Digging Deeper to have heard the message, but just briefly, like, do you want to just kind of summarize, like, this is kind of what you took, the big ideas that you took out of Habakkuk yesterday?
Yeah, so Habakkuk is, in a lot of ways, a challenging, almost depressing book in some ways, because Habakkuk starts by examining Judah. It's his direct world around him. Judah happens to be God's chosen people, but they are not acting like it,
Right.
is what's apparent in the book of Habakkuk, especially in those first 4 verses. And he opens the book with a very messy, emotional, raw, pretty disrespectful, actually, complaining of what is happening. And he's starting to question God. Are you not looking? Are you going to do anything? Why do I have to look? And you're just tolerating this. And then he starts to make accusations. He says things like, the law is paralyzed. Justice never prevails. And you know, the wicked hem in the righteous. It's like these accusations. And he starts complaining to God in this way. And so I kind of started by saying, because the hinge statement of Habakkuk is found in chapter 2, verse 4, which kind of gives us a solution to the way that you handle when things are not the way that you think they should be. And it says, the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. And so the question became, okay, the righteous person will live by his faithfulness even when he's got complaints.
Yeah.
And then we went into, because if you look at the book of Habakkuk, after he makes his complaints to God, God answers him. But the answers that God gives him, he tells him, I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, this small people group from the east that's actually going to become not a small people group. They're going to take over Babylon. It's going to be this huge thing. It's going to be just this, you know, this big force in the world that's going to carry you away to captivity. And it's going to exact my judgment that you're actually complaining isn't happening. It's coming. To which Habakkuk is bewildered. He doesn't understand. God, why would you use people that are even more wicked? Why would you let them have their way? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so
why don't you punish them? They're evil too.
Yeah, punish them too. And God says, I will, but first, you know, I'm going to deal with this. And so, you know, the next question is, how does a righteous person live by his faithfulness, even when God is confusing? And then finally, I keep looking, and maybe you do too, and so many of us, and if you've read Habakkuk, you keep looking as you're reading. It's only 3 chapters long, but you're waiting for the moment where everything kind of gets wrapped up and you see, oh, look, God wins, and it all worked out okay, and everything's just perfect in the book of Habakkuk, and that isn't the case. In fact, Habakkuk doesn't end with any pretty bows on it. And so the next question was, what do you do? How do you live as a righteous person who will live by his faithfulness, even when there's no closure? And so I went through those 3 points. When you've got complaints, when God is confusing, when there's no closure, how do you be a righteous person who will live by God's faithfulness?
Yeah. And in that way, Habakkuk is similar, but also unique among the minor prophets. You know, I think of like, there's a little bit of Jonah with Habakkuk in the sense
and
of
a little bit of Job.
Yeah, in the writing style, even of like, so we've like earlier we covered Joel. And the book of Joel is very much a message to the people. Like God is saying this to you.
Yes.
And a lot of like Jeremiah, Isaiah, they're messages to the people.
Whereas Jonah
Habakkuk is like a recording of his own argument with God. But what's interesting is it's still a message to the people because his argument with God is the message. And similar to Job, yeah, you're right. Job is probably a little more like, there's definitely a lot of questions about where does Job fit in terms of, is this more poetry, wisdom literature? Habakkuk clearly fits in the line of, here is a prophet who has heard from the Lord and is telling the people, but the way he's doing it is by sharing his own wrestling, his own conversation with God. But you're right in the sense too of like, even with, and we'll get into this probably a little bit more in 2 weeks, the nature of many of the prophets being sort of like like when I think, well, Joel was a good example. When we talked about Joel, I said, look, like all the prophets, he announces judgment, doom, and destruction things. But then Joel's also interesting because he looks ahead to this glorious future. Habakkuk doesn't really look ahead to the glorious future. It's not like, hey, and we're going to talk about this difference between punishment and discipline and the idea that God loves us. But Habakkuk is just more like, this sucks. I don't like this. What are you doing? But I'll praise you anyway. He doesn't give that sort of carrot on the stick at the other side that like an Isaiah or a Jeremiah does. So yeah, it's to say like, I could see why when you mentioned, because you mentioned earlier, like to me personally, like this was sort of a dark book to be
depressing book,
because there was no other side of it. There was no like, it's going to be great on the other side, which some of the prophets do, but he doesn't.
No,
he just leaves you with this. Yeah, live by faith. Which I will say, and maybe we can come back to this.
Okay.
There is another side to that because that verse gets used in the sort of ultimate moment of humanity for Paul. At the apex of everything God does is he quotes that verse and says, look, it's happened in Jesus.
Twice,
yeah.
Maybe 3 times if he wrote Hebrews.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but before that, I think one thing that was interesting, and you definitely... So you gave us these sort of 3 words about responding, and it was waiting, it was watching, and worship. And the idea being, okay, there is sort of a healthy way to work through this, but there's also an unhealthy way to work through this. I think just like being very practical, like moving aside from the passages, just being practical. I don't know, because even in our staff meeting last week, you walked us through back a little bit. We were thinking Habakkuk, talking about when you're struggling with God, when you're wrestling, when you're feeling uncertain or questioning. What would you say are some unhealthy ways to go about that versus more healthy ways in your own life, or as you would pastor people through that?
I don't know if it's unhealthy with the way you start, but with the way that you go and the way that you end. I've noticed that a lot of times it can be tempting to stay in that first stage where you're just complaining. And you see that happen a lot with people in their lives.
Sure.
Perhaps you've seen it in your own life. I've seen it in mine, where I'll spend too much time in just that stage of complaining, and I'll just identify everything that is broken and everything that is wrong all the time. And it starts to expand those things and give me a pessimistic outlook and a negative viewpoint on everything else around me to the point where even things that are good and uplifting, I'll tear them down in my heart. I don't know if you've ever been there. And so that is a very destructive place to be. And it usually is a path that leads to a lot of darkness and usually a lot of questioning, sometimes some deconstruction, right? As you start to have this negative outlook on every aspect of everything, and you even count what is good as bad. And so that's probably a destructive thing.
But, and I'm not disagreeing.
Okay.
Like, I guess just if somebody's listening, at the same time, it's not like God doesn't give us some room for complaining.
No, so that's the beauty of Habakkuk, right? The fact that even when you're complaining, what I mentioned was, notice this, God lets him, right? God lets him. And he doesn't actually, you don't see this strong reproof, a little bit, but not like a hugely strong reproof onto Habakkuk in the book of Habakkuk. You don't see God laying into him and telling him, why are you complaining?
Yeah.
He says things like, well,
it's not like Job where God's like, how dare you? It's more like, okay, I hear you.
Yeah, he answers them, and he's so gentle to answer him. He answers them very directly on the things that he's actually caring and concerned about. Habakkuk says, why do you make me look at injustice? And God actually makes it so personal and says, I hear you. Keep looking. Yeah. And it answers his actual complaint. It's not like it's disconnected and so far removed. It's very intimate and it's very connected. And so he says, keep looking, just look bigger, look at the nations. And then he says, you'll be amazed. You won't believe it if I were to even tell you. And then he says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. And he tells him what he's doing, and that just throws Habakkuk for a loop. But the fact that he lets Habakkuk air his complaints, and he lets him air them in a very raw, honestly, I mentioned this in the message, it sounds like smack talk. It sounds like he's smack talking God. He's getting really real. He's getting really raw, really emotional. And I think that's important. Sometimes we have this paradigm that we aren't allowed to, as if God doesn't know what's happening in our mind and heart already. Yeah. So even if we're having those complaints in our mind and heart, how dare us say it in our prayers? And the truth is Habakkuk gives us this picture of a prophet who gets really raw, really real, really emotional, pretty disrespectful with God. I'm not advocating for that. But he does, and God is so relational, I would say. And I think it's a good word for it, relational with us, that he'll actually allow that, hear it, respond to it, redirect us in such a sensitive and gentle way.
Yeah.
And he does that with Habakkuk. And so that is not an unhealthy part of the process. But if we stay there, it becomes a destructive force in our life. The healthy way to kind of move through this is to end where Habakkuk ends. Where you get to the point where you kind of, because what happens is we look at our circumstances, we look at the world around us, we look at the situations, we look at how other people are acting, and we make judgments, right? Like, that's actually not, sometimes we hear over and over again, it's so bad to judge. Well, part of humanity is you make judgments all the time, right? You judge whether or not something is safe to sit on, if it's a chair, or if, whether or not, you should be going 75 on the freeway or 65. You make judgments all the time, right? With the things around you. And so Habakkuk makes some judgments about what he sees, but then he fixes his eyes on God. And that's the important part. He starts to look towards God more and more, and then he wrestles with that. You see him going back and forth with he's wrestling with looking at God and looking at his goodness, his faithfulness, his greatness, and then looking at a circumstance again. But then he ends finally by saying, I'm just going to trust in you. I'm going to have faith, and I'm going to trust that you are going to be the one that I'm going to rejoice in, that you're going to be my strength, and that you're actually going to give my feet a firm foundation. And he gives us that picture of the hind's feet in high places.
Which is a great analogy, yeah. One thing I was thinking as you were talking about that, and I think it's like, it's almost like this like weird, like there has to be a line somewhere and no one can set it for you. No one can say, this is the line where you stop complaining and start being positive, right? Everyone's on their own journey, but it does exist. Yeah. And if you don't eventually cross over it and you always stay in the dark complaining places, like it doesn't end well for anyone. And so I like that. I like how you said that. I would point out, like, again, comparing different books, God's response to Job is pretty heavy and heavy-handed. Like, brace yourself, I'm about to answer you. You're like, whoa. Yeah. The difference, though, and this is a key difference theologically, and sometimes theology is important, because what God responds to in Job is a mischaracterization of his character and an accusation that he's unjust. Oh, I see. The book of Job is accusing God of being unfair and not doing the right thing. And God says, oh, you're going to accuse me of being unfair. I'm going to respond. Habakkuk doesn't accuse God of being unfair. Habakkuk just hates his current reality. Well, it sucks.
He accuses God of turning a blind eye, shutting his ears.
Well, but he's saying, like, he's not wrong, though, that the world is wicked and broken and evil. He's not wrong that, like, around him bad things are happening. Yeah. And he's saying, God, I'm wrestling with the fact that you're allowing this. It's true that you're allowing this. There's no, like, because you're God and you're all powerful. Yeah. So in some ways, I would say, like, if you were to take like two maybe examples and they're crass or whatever, they're not crass, but like just in my head, like one person may be wrestling with God because, they wanted a new house and God didn't give it to them. So come on, God, how dare you, Sure. Like, well, wait, did God even promise you? Another person, maybe they got diagnosed with cancer or something. And it's like, God, why are you letting this happen? Mm-hmm. The difference between those two examples is like, well, one is maybe bringing an unfair accusation against God for something he didn't do or promise. The other is just legitimately wrestling with something that sucks. And I think that's the thing about Habakkuk is like, and what's so important about your saying is, as Habakkuk is wrestling with something that legitimately sucks around him, God isn't, like you said, he isn't throwing lightning bolts. He isn't being like, how dare you quit? He's like, I know, I see it, I know. And he's letting Habakkuk just vent and be like, I hate this. I'm upset by this. I don't like this. And there's this complaining factor that God almost just sort of like accepts. Mm-hmm. But then, like you said, he kind of steers him. And I love, and when we were talking about it and stuff, being one of my favorite lines of Habakkuk is when he says, "I'll stand on the wall."
Yeah, chapter 2, verse 1 and 2.
Yeah, and you use the word watch, which is a good word. I also like the idea of just like I'm gonna keep doing what I'm called to do, because a prophet was supposed to stand on the wall and hey, problems are coming. Like it's looking like I'm gonna keep doing my job even if things around me don't make sense. Like I'm gonna choose, which ultimately gets you back to that point of like I'm gonna choose to keep being faithful.
And what I love about that is he actually uses military language.
Yeah.
He talks about climbing up into his watchtower, and that is a military term
Mm-hmm.
which speaks to this idea of duty.
A lot
Where
of it,
where
yeah.
where it's this idea that despite the circumstances, despite his feelings about them, he has a duty and a responsibility that he's going to stay loyal to.
Yeah.
And he's going to determine to do that.
Which is like in many ways what the word faithful would have meant.
Sure. Yes.
So when God says, when Habakkuk is like, why are you doing this? When are you going to fix it? God doesn't say, oh, I'm going to fix it this way at this point in this time. He just says, hey, if the righteous, the ones who are doing the right thing in my eyes, are the ones that even amidst all of this chaos, continue to be faithful and do what I've called them to do. And like, it's almost like I can't speak to this from a lot of personal experience because I haven't dealt with tragedy the way that other people have. And I know that, and I'm grateful for it. But I also acknowledge I have to be careful how I speak. But it's almost like in the midst of those darkest moments, God is saying, I'll accept and embrace your complaints, your anger, your yelling and screaming.
Frustration
I'm not asking anything out of you. Just don't give up. Right?
Yeah.
Like the only thing I'm going to tell you in this moment is through all this feeling, all this of just don't give up.
And I think that's the actual difference between Job and Habakkuk. Job was ready to give up. All the influences around him were trying to tell him
his wife was telling him to give up and die.
Curse God and die,
Yeah.
So he was facing a temptation and almost a pivot point where it was give up or hold on. And so God gets really strong with him.
Yeah.
It's almost like the do or die moment. It's a fight or flee moment. And so God really kind of gets, in his face a little bit more. With Habakkuk is still wrestling, and he's still kind of in the middle of, he's going back and forth. I love how Habakkuk is even trying to convince himself, which I do all the time, that even though a circumstance doesn't make sense and I'm confused by the way that God is working it out, I try to convince myself, well, God has a different perspective than me. He's bigger than me. He's God. I need to let God be God. I stuff like that. He starts by saying things like, I know that you're from everlasting, God. And Habakkuk is trying to, just like we do oftentimes, convince himself and try to wrestle within his own mind about what God is doing and allowing God to do it however he wants to do, but at the same time wrestling with the very real feelings that he has and the very real opinions that he has about why in the world they're going to do it like this.
Yeah.
This doesn't make sense.
Not the way I would do it.
Yeah. Like,
right.
As if you have a better way. But
yeah, which we always think we do.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's such an interesting book. I and so many of the minor prophets have these sides of them that can feel dark and heavy and sometimes, anger or whatever. And then, but you find that moment, that nugget, which is kind of what this whole series is about. And where I sort of from week one set it up as like, I kind of made the comment about, these books sometimes feeling like the buttons on your remote you don't normally use. Like they're not, who is Habakkuk? I don't know. Who are the Chaldeans? I don't know any of this stuff. But then you dig into it and you find this message that says, in the midst of all of your wrestling with God, just don't give up. And that is righteousness. Like righteousness isn't, I'll never complain. I'll never get angry. I'll never express emotion or feeling. It's, I'll go through all the stages of grief, but I'm going to keep being faithful and get back on the wall like you told me to do.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is the hardest thing, because the easiest thing to do when you're upset or angry at God is quit and be like, I'm done with all this. So that's it's in that way, it's probably the most important thing he could say.
Especially in this day and age, because I think that our culture is colliding with Christianity in such a way that it's starting to ask some really provocative questions about morality or about what is right and what is wrong, about religion, about all these different things. I mean, for example, even just, why are the world is kind of it's naming kind of the LGBTQ plus agenda like as synonymous with love, right? Love is love, and those kind of things. And then there's becomes these big questions about, well, if Christianity is supposed to be all about love, then why is it so antithesis to this and so resistant to this movement over here that seems to also be about love? And it just seems like our culture, and that's just one example, but we could go through tons of them. Our culture is ramping up to a point where it's starting to collide, and this isn't anything new, but it feels new now. We're starting to collide with a lot of pieces of Christianity as well, which brings up a lot of questions. And and I'm sure you hear them as a pastor as well. People have a lot of questions about, is God really good, or is Christianity, are you just a Christian because you're raised in a Christian family? What if you were raised in a Hindu family? Would you be Hindu? Like things like that. A lot of relativity, right? A lot of those type of belief systems.
Yeah.
And so all those things are starting to collide, and a lot of people are asking a lot of questions. Things are confusing. There's a lot of ammo to formulate a lot of complaints these days.
Yeah.
What do you think you do? How do you think a Christian's supposed to respond in a moment like that in history where it feels like culture is presenting a lot of provocative questions that are kind of like the complaints of, the questions and challenges that people are wrestling with God about?
Yeah, I think obviously, like I don't know that Habakkuk has anything to say about how you respond to the culture. I think its
right.
brilliance is more of like, how do I work this out with God?
Yeah.
Which is why the book is so interesting to me. I like peering into this argument between he and God, and like the Psalms, you see a lot of this with, they used songs and psalms to wrestle with God a lot. A lot of the things that Habakkuk is wrestling with, you have mirror psalms. God,
Yeah.
why are the wicked prospering? Why are you allowing this? I think with culture, there's the question of like, well, how do I talk about it? How do I engage other people outside of it? But in terms of like, God, why are you allowing this to happen? Like that alone is a big question.
It is a big question.
And I think people, here's what's interesting for me about it is, for a lot of people, I think rather than wrestling with God about it, they want to just fight people.
Oh, explain that. That's good.
Well, it's like, I don't want to wrestle with God about what's going on or why he's allowing it. I just want to like get on social media or whatever and yell at people who I disagree with. And I think there are Christians who probably are like in their heart, like, God, why are you letting all this happen?
Mm-hmm.
Like you're in control. Why? It feels, it can feel as a Christian in America, like we're losing something, and we all say that different ways, and it expresses itself different ways, especially in politics. But the sense that it's moving away from what we wanted or liked or wanted it to be, it's headed in the wrong direction. People that we disagree with that don't appear to have God's agenda seem to be, if I could use I don't mean it this way, but quote unquote winning, right? And that's Habakkuk's thing. Like the people who seem to be winning right now are not the people who hold faith in the one true God.
Faithful.
They're pagans who are worshiping, like the Babylonians were evil, wicked, horrible people.
Yeah.
Like, why are you letting them win? And they're even judging us. They're coming against us and we're losing. Like, where are you, God? What are you doing right now? And so to hear like God say something, and he doesn't say this in Habakkuk, but the sentiment of, I'm actually using these people to refine you and discipline you and make you better. Like, we don't want that. We just want, no, judge those people and destroy them because they're wicked and evil. The idea that God, and this is a whole other message that it's in my brain because I've started working on it. Of all of the 8 messages I had mapped out for this series, the one that I was the least wanting to do is the one I have
up in a couple weeks here.
Yeah, like the difference between judgment and discipline.
Yeah,
that discipline by its nature is God, whether he's just using it or he's actually causing it, is bringing something difficult and painful against you in order to actually better you.
Yep.
And we're so uncomfortable with that. Like, so we're even as parents, we're uncomfortable with that. Even as parenting, it's like, oh, I would never hurt my child. It's like, sometimes like pain is the best way to bring about a better result. And it's like even saying that sentence out loud is like, is someone going to call, child protective services on me? And I'm right. And it's a whole other conversation. But like to even step back and say, is it possible that the church in America needs to lose a little bit in order to find its soul again? It's okay to be that way and feel that way. But at the end of the day, do I trust in the end of the day, God is still God and going to work things out? And what working things out might look nothing like I ever expected.
So good.
And so the reason why I can say that is because Habakkuk leaves you on a cliffhanger. There's nothing.
There's no closure.
But there is closure in the Bible because 400 years later, Paul will say the righteousness of God, the goodness of God, the truth of God, his faithfulness to his promises has now been revealed in Jesus. What God said he would do, what Habakkuk wrestled with, God, when are you going to deal with the problem of evil in the world? When are you going to save and restore us? He has done it. And then Paul quotes Habakkuk, the righteous will live by faith, which I don't think Paul was making a theological statement. I think he was drawing your eye back to Habakkuk and saying, remember Habakkuk? God is now doing, when God said, just trust me, Habakkuk, we now see the trustworthiness of God seen in the face of Jesus. And it never happened the way that we thought. Babylon is long gone. The Greeks are gone. Now we got the Romans, whatever. Like, it was never what we thought it was going to be. What God was doing was bigger and greater and better than anything Habakkuk ever would have thought. Because defeating a temporary army in the 5th century BC was just another army. Who cares? What God did in Jesus changed humanity from its core. And so God's plan was always bigger, and calling him to live and trust him did have closure 5 centuries later. And you're like, oh.
Well, and you pointed this out in a conversation too. When Paul quotes Habakkuk, he actually quotes it differently.
He does a little bit. Yeah, he changes the wording.
Yeah, so it's no longer the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. He removes that pronoun, and he says the righteous will live by faith.
Yeah, and even the word faithfulness and faith.
And faith are two different ideas.
Well, it depends. I would argue differently, and there's different agreements on this. I think that when Paul used the simple word faith, he actually had the word faithfulness in his mind.
Okay.
There are many Christians who disagree with me and think that Paul was actually talking about saved by grace through faith, not works.
Yes.
I don't think he was. And people that are in my camp don't read Romans that way. They would say, no, Paul is saying the righteous people, the people who are now shown as being in the right, are the ones who always stood with faith, waiting for God to do what he did right now. And those who trusted God and waited for him to come and do this are now the vindicated ones who have been mocked for centuries and put down for centuries. But now you're seeing that God was always going to come through. And so those of you that trusted and waited on God, you're now the ones that are standing there saying, see, we told you so. And that Paul is able to say that himself.
So you would say that in Romans, Paul's main argument isn't that that we are reconciled back to God through grace, through faith alone, or by grace through faith alone.
Well, Paul believes that.
Okay.
I just think, but I don't think that's what he's talking about in Romans 1, 2, and 3. Because he starts off in Romans 1 talking about how why the world is in the predicament. We've turned away from God. We've fallen into all this sin. Everything is like God, like this is terrible. The world is broken.
He's talking about the unrighteousness of the world.
Yeah.
And then he gets into the self-righteousness of...
Right. And he says, and even you Jewish people, you think you're better. You're actually not. At the end of the day, all of us are in the same... All the wicked, we're all wicked.
God's wrath, is what he
so
says,
when Habakkuk is like, why are you letting the wicked prosper? You're just as wicked. However, now God's true righteousness has been revealed. Chapter 3.
Yeah.
And something that he was always going to do is now being done. And those of us that were trusting him and believing him and now put our trust in Jesus are the ones who will see it and get to experience it. So the idea of being vindicated or justified is a very interesting dynamic word because its root in Greek is to be in the right. Mm-hmm. That's why the word English made up a word righteous, righteous. Yeah. But to be justified means like you were just, you were the right one. So that word can mean I'm doing the right thing. Like who stole the cookies? Not me. Oh, you're righteous.
Or I'm loyal to the right thing.
It could also be like vindicated in the sense of like at the end of the day, oh man, you were right the whole time. Shoot, we should have listened to you. And so when Jesus uses that word, like you'll see the Son of Man on the clouds of glory. There's this sense of like, you're going to see how wrong you are and how right I am pretty soon. And Paul is saying those that turn their backs from God, those that chose to no longer be faithful, to walk away from it, are now missing out on the goodness of God revealed in Jesus. And those of us that choose to dive in and give our lives to him and trust him in this will actually see what we've all been waiting for. We're now experiencing what Habakkuk longed for. So I think Paul is looking back to Habakkuk and bringing the whole book into Romans and saying, remember when Habakkuk wrestled and fought and said, God, where are you at? What are you doing? What in the world? This is what in the world. It was always Jesus.
That is interesting because in Hebrews, it kind of supports that viewpoint of yours as well. Because in Hebrews, it also quotes the just or the righteous shall live by faith. At the beginning of what we call the hall of faith a lot of times.
Which were all people who never saw it, but trusted and waited anyway.
Yeah. And it was counted to them as righteousness.
Yeah. You're among the righteous because even though you didn't see it, Habakkuk, even if you don't see it, even if you die before you see it, continue to be faithful to me and trust me, and you'll be counted among the righteous. And for the Jewish people, that's not just like a philosophical thing. It's no, you'll actually be resurrected and get to live in that new life one day. So that's the Christian hope, that we'll be counted among the righteous because right now we're living by faith that God is doing something in Jesus. And in the future, the verdict is already in because of my faith in him today, my choice to remain faithful to him today and trust him. I can complain. I can get angry. I can throw stuff around my house if I want to. God's okay with that to a degree. Mm-hmm. But will I keep going and keep trusting him and live by faith anyway? And I think that's the beauty of your whole message and the tension we live in.
Yeah.
I think one last thing is interesting to me. In terms of healthy and unhealthy, I think what's also interesting about that is all of us play different roles in the world. We have roles at work. We have roles at home. We have positions. We have, when I'm a child and I have no one accountable to me, I can throw a temper tantrum.
Yeah.
When I'm a father and I'm responsible for my house, maybe I can't throw as much attention. What's interesting is like thinking about how even a healthy way to deal with wrestling with God sometimes can change based upon your position, where you're at, like, how I might respond knowing my kids are watching could be different. As a pastor, this is the weirdest thing because as pastors, we need to be, we can't stop being human, right? We're human, but we're also people that are trying to set examples for others, which is a very interesting dynamic because I want to be authentic. I want you to be authentic. But I also know that my wrestling with God, the way that I might do it in certain seasons of my life, I also am aware, sort of cognizant of like, are there people in my life who are looking to me for strength or courage or some sense of stability, and my insane wrestling is actually hurting them? I don't know. Have you ever felt that tension before?
Yes. And that's why I think it's really important to be real, to be authentic. And also, I would say that it can be dangerous to make your motivation to be some sort of great example for everybody else. A better motivation is simply you fear God. And so instead of being afraid that people are going to watch you and they're going to think that it's okay to respond to certain things a certain way if you watch you respond that way, consider God is watching you. And if you fear God and you want to please him because he's such a good God to you, then you will respond in the way that he calls you to, which will be a good example and will lead people in a way that is real and authentic.
Yeah, I think I
hear that perfectly. No, but
I would say like with God, I think though there are things that God is okay with me. And I'm just speaking in generalities like that. Okay, so here's
talking about like the way you wrestle.
Here's an example. Like, okay, so as a married person, a challenge that I think all of us have as married people, especially in ministry, but it's true of anything, even in your line of work, whatever your line of work is. My wife is oftentimes my sounding board, right? She's the person that she wants to know how my day was. And if it's a bad day, she gets all of it, right? She receives all of the venting. But then I go back to work the next day, and this is even, I'm not even talking about ministry, whatever job, we've been married 15 years, other jobs I've had. I go back to work the next day, and I sit down with my boss who I had a fight with or something, and we have a great conversation, and we quote unquote work it out. And then I go back to work and I'm fine. But my wife's still at home thinking my boss is a terrible human being because all that she got was my venting, and she never got my she never saw the resolving of it. And I think the challenge is like the way in which I wrestle with God and allow other people into that process can be dangerous, because the words that I use, the things that I say that are in my own moment of weakness or trial, I can resolve with God. But if I haven't let them into the process, if they're looking to me and they're following me, and if my kids see me wrestling with God, but don't see me resolve things with God, then could they walk away to being like, oh, God sucks, And I think sometimes I worry about that, and it can make me, it gives me the, it's tempting to be fake in order to be a better husband, father, pastor, leader.
Gotcha.
Like, I don't want people to see my wrestling, because then they might not also see my resolution and think that I don't know. It's
well, Paul kind of talks about the attitude of this in regards to liberty, right? He talks about like, if you want to do certain things, like he talks about
1 Corinthians 5.
Yeah, he talks about actually almost like censoring yourself so that you don't stumble up other people. Mm-hmm. And some people could say, well, that's being fake. You're not being fully yourself and things like that too. But the truth is that no, what you're doing is you're actually considering others more than you're considering yourself. And so the example that we see in Habakuk actually is that he wrestles in private.
But then God. He writes a book and gives it the whole
Jewish nation. Great point. So,
but I don't think in an unhealthy way.
But not in an unhealthy way, because he shows the whole thing.
He does.
He shows a resolve too.
And he writes down what God said back to him.
Yes.
Which is stay faithful, stand on the wall. Like, and I wasn't trying to say that because I think I'm still coming back to are there unhealthy ways to express and work through disappointment or confusion or anger at God? And I would just say, like, I do think that one potential unhealthy way can be not being sensitive, maybe, to the way that you're expressing. And this is a big problem for me as a person, because I can kind of just be this hugely openly transparent, everybody knows how I'm feeling kind of human being. That one of the unhealthy ways in my life that I have found that I have to be careful when I express my disappointment with God is not being considerate and sensitive to who is hearing me complain that isn't maybe in a position to handle that well.
Well, I mean, I think it's just like when you are arguing with your wife, right? It's disrespectful to your wife if you argue in front of all your friends.
Or your kids sometimes.
Or your kids, or things like that too.
It's unhealthy for my kids to hear it too much.
And it's unhealthy in that way. So what do you do? Out of love, out of respect and honor, you hold it, and then you wait for a better time.
You put them to bed, and then you start screaming. No,
no. But I'm saying, like, that's part of it too. And then you have a conversation. Yeah. And then sometimes you also measure and say, no. I mean, there are times when my wife and I'll say, no. I don't, we're not yelling, we're not angry, but we are kind of like, we're kind of debating more than disagreeing, but we're kind of talking through it. I don't mind our kids watching.
Well, it's good for them to learn healthy conflict resolution.
Yes.
There's a time and place for it.
So there's times where I'm strategic and I'll say, no. Like, let's actually have this conversation in front of the kids.
Yeah.
This is good.
And I think the same is true with wrestling with God. There are times and places that I want them to see that I do too, and that it's okay that they do. And here's a way forward. But there are other times that I'm like, I probably need to keep this inside for right now until I work it out a bit more. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just the difference, like saying, like, are there better and worse ways to handle it? Yeah. I think God can handle anything I throw at him as long as I'm committed and not giving up. But I need to be careful what other people hear me throwing at him in certain situations. And that's just wisdom, I think. So, well, this got heavy.
Okay, well, there you go.
It's a good conversation. Habakuk. It was a heavy book.
It's a heavy book.
So next week, our young and up and coming
he's already here.
Anthony. I just meant our youth pastor Anthony is going to bring the word, dive in the minor prophets. Yes. It's going to be exciting, and it'll be good. So maybe the two of you can dig into his message next Monday on Digging Deeper. Something will be fun. So it'll be good. And you did a great job this week, man. It was a great message. Really appreciate you bringing it. I heard a ton of feedback from it. A lot of people were really helped by it, I think,
Good.
which is more than like moved. Like, I think that was helpful information I needed in my life, and that's so good. So thank you for that. And yeah, we'll be back next week. Stay at it, do the Minor Prophets, and keep going at it. So
All right, we'll see you then.
see you guys.